The beginning of the rise didn't look like the beginning of a rise. Not far from the tiny country of El Salvador's capital city, San Salvador, is a smaller city, Santa Tecla. And not far outside of Santa Tecla is the tiny coffee town of 𝐌𝐸𝐽𝐽 𝐾𝐚𝐢𝐥𝐲. Though only a 7-mile, 12-kilometer drive from San Salvador, this 7,000-person city feels far away from the busy capital. And it was here in 2012 where 2,754 voters put their faith in a young, business-savvy political newcomer for mayor, defeating the Conservative Party opposition by the slimmest of margins, just 169 votes. But such a narrow margin didn't dim the young Nayib Bukele's ambition. While he ran with the leftist FMLN, Bukele's campaign from the very beginning focused less on party lines and more on purpose. A confident, energetic 30-year-old bent on snuffing out crime and corruption and investing in education, infrastructure, and community development. Today, the marks of Bukele's time as mayor are hard to miss in 𝐌𝐸𝐽𝐽 𝐾𝐚𝐢𝐥𝐲. First came education. Upon taking office, Bukele announced he'd forfeit his salary so could instead help fund a scholarship program. In that year, 𝐌𝐸𝐽𝐽 𝐾𝐚𝐢𝐥𝐲's illiteracy rate stood at about 15%. With the launch of a citywide reading program, Salvadoran press celebrated that in 2015, the city was free of illiteracy, making it the third town in the department to reach the mark and moving it well ahead of the national average. The other metric that Bukele would go on to tout in future campaigns was that while he was in office, 𝐌𝐸𝐽𝐽 𝐾𝐚𝐢𝐥𝐲 only saw a single homicide. While the exact number was disputed, the exceptionally low homicide rate was a major point of pride, as the country has been fighting the violent and entrenched MS-13 and Barrio 18 gangs since the end of its civil war in 1992. It's been an uphill battle against the hyper-violent and incredibly cruel gangs since Bukele was a teenager, so no matter how relatively safe the small town was to begin with, in a country with a legacy of gang violence, such a safety record was as much an accomplishment as education for the young mayor. The other successes of Bukele's office were more tangible. At the end of 2012, the city opened its first 24/7 medical clinic. Moving fast and not worried about how the city would pay for things, ground broke on a new library, and the city embarked on a multi-million-dollar water project that would make drinking water available 24 hours a day rather than the meager 3 hours available previously. In 3 years, 𝐌𝐸𝐽𝐽 𝐾𝐚𝐢𝐥𝐲 went from an unexceptional provincial town to exemplary. If politicians just took bold action, the town proved, things could change for the better of everyone. At the same pace that the city changed, the leader of the transformation went from unheard of to the next big thing. Prior to politics, Bukele's career had made stops in consulting and political advertising for the party he now represented. Now, as a politician himself, he made the most of his professional experience. No good deed would go unclaimed or underreported. If infrastructure and education projects didn't sell Salvadorans on the small-town mayor's standing as a politician for the people, perhaps the YouTube channel would. Here he posted clips of his interviews and debates that aired over local television. But he didn't stop at just getting his message out. He used the platform to further an image of a man firmly for the people, posting videos of him moving through the town, talking with kids, celebrating the launch of the medical center, and answering questions from the community. The brand building wasn't confined to the internet either. On everything that the mayor touched, the library, the hospital, the signs at city limits and construction sites alike, and the podiums from which he spoke, was now a light blue N, which replaced the city's prior logo and highlighted the positive transformations directly connected to Nayib Bukele's term. The project worked. He remade the city, and in doing so, built a personal image as a champion of the people, unafraid to greenlight big projects and take big swings. While mayor for only a single 3-year term, journalists now visiting years on are hard-pressed to find a single person in 𝐌𝐸𝐽𝐽 𝐾𝐚𝐢𝐥𝐲 that has a bad thing to say about him. While Bukele's time as mayor was transformative, it was also short. Bigger things beckoned as both he and the FMLN recognized that the new guy with bold ideas and a record so sterling had huge potential in a political environment dominated by aging voices of the Civil War that had ended decades ago. The logical progression was the mayor's office of the nation's capital, an office that would garner more attention and potentially position the ascendant politician for a presidential run. While San Salvador dwarfs 𝐌𝐸𝐽𝐽 𝐾𝐚𝐢𝐥𝐲, Bukele took a similar approach. He built a new library, reinvigorated old shopping markets, invested in infrastructure, spent serious money, and signed off on glitzy vanity projects to ensure his image rose along with the city's. Salvadorans followed, and his popularity continued to rise. Nationally, though, other trends were on the rise in equal proportion. By the time Bukele took office, a truce between MS-13, Barrio 18, and the national government had recently collapsed. In 2 years, homicide rates had more than doubled, and by 2015, the country was seeing an average of 18 homicides a day, while its 103 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants had ballooned to the world's worst rate. At the very same time, the nation's prisons were beginning to overflow as the federal government leaned back into heavy-handed gang policies that threw more and more gang-affiliated Salvadorans behind bars. From 2010 to 2016, the country's total prison population grew by more than 11,000, while the incarceration rate hit 579, far outpacing any other Central American country and nearing the top of the list globally. While Nayib Bukele's name recognition was expanding and image as a big idea reformer was sharpening, the country was crumbling. Gangs killed dispassionately, while the government arrested citizens indiscriminately. Salvadorans were nothing short of desperate for change, as the threat of gang violence now impacted every aspect of everyday life. Old politicians and old policies just weren't enough anymore. A lane emerged. For decades, El Salvador's politics effectively ran as a two-party system. It was FMLN or it was ARENA. No serious candidate would even consider running for high office without aligning themselves with one of the two. But despite surging popularity, Bukele's support from FMLN, his party was waning as he constantly broke rank and strayed from their platform, so in response, he was failing to get the votes of his own party members for some of his mayoral ambitions. They became the barrier to his goals. This quickly devolved into a vicious cycle of one criticizing the other and vice versa, before finally, Bukele gave them an excuse to get rid of him. FMLN officials alleged that he called their lawyer a bruja, a derogatory term that roughly translates to witch. This, and its violation of their ethics policies, was the reason given for his expulsion from FMLN, but all understood that it was heavily, if not entirely predicated by his increasingly distant and hostile relationship with the party. The fallout with FMLN took Bukele off what appeared a predestined path towards the presidency. He clearly couldn't join ARENA, the opposition, and without either support, precedent suggested a successful presidential run was impossible. But regardless, he forged on. Wanting to form his own party, but unable to in time for the upcoming election, Bukele teamed up with the Grande Alianza para la Unidad Nacional, meaning his incredibly long-shot presidential run could begin. Both traditional nominees, backed by the traditional parties, ran traditional campaigns, rotating between TV appearances, radio interviews, and stump speeches about why they'd be the best person to put at the helm of the Salvadoran political system. Bukele, meanwhile, argued that the system itself was the problem. He promised to gut the establishment and its corruption, largely delivering this message through Facebook and Twitter, attaining skyrocketing engagement with each. His few physical campaign events more closely resembled parties as he hosted dressed like a Silicon Valley CEO, not a suited presidential candidate. As election day neared, the polls trended increasingly towards his direction, and so confident in his position, he didn't even show up to the debates, unwilling to even engage with the mainstream political candidacy system. It may have been risky, but it worked. The FMLN candidate attained 14.4% of the vote, the ARENA one 31.7%, and Nayib Bukele, the 37-year-old outsider, commanded 53.1%. Such a decisive victory that the almost inevitable runoff wasn't even necessary. On June 1st, 2019, Bukele assumed office and became the 43rd president of the Republic of El Salvador. Change came quick. In the days that followed, Bukele unveiled his so-called territorial control plan. The plan that would transform El Salvador from one of the most dangerous countries in the world to one where people could simply go outside without fear. It reportedly had 6 phases, with a 7th to be implemented only if the rest didn't work. Each phase was only unveiled at its start, but the first states that people have the right to mount an insurrection if lawmakers fail to follow the Constitution, and therefore, Bukele implicitly asked his supporters to come to the Legislative Assembly prepared to overthrow the government. So they did, surrounding the building, but ultimately only 20 of 84 lawmakers showed up, far from the minimum needed to legally vote on legislation. Regardless, Bukele arrived, and not alone. Marching into the chamber with him were dozens of police and military personnel donned in military fatigues and armed with rifles. While they surrounded lawmakers, Bukele delivered a brief 10-minute speech demanding a return to what he considered constitutional order, furious that the majority of lawmakers disobeyed his dubious order. Now, the key question was what this event actually was. Was it Bukele bringing in the army and police essentially as props? Visual devices to convey the importance of passing the legislation that would better equip them? Or was it a show of force, an implicit threat? A reminder to lawmakers that the guys with the guns were on his side, which they very much were, given the $109 million he was about to give them. While this series of events was quickly considered a constitutional crisis and critiqued the world over, distraction came quick as the COVID-19 virus reached El Salvador's borders. On March 21st, the president announced a mandatory nationwide lockdown with violators subject to detainment in special pandemic containment centers. Almost immediately, potential legal issues arose. Some 70 people were arrested in the early hours of March 22nd before the details of the president's decree were even published. That is, arrested for violation of a law that wasn't even officially publicized. Others were arrested for not wearing masks, despite not yet being legally required, others still for traveling to jobs deemed essential by the decree itself. It was a constitutionally dubious law to begin with, but even then it was applied arbitrarily and with problematically generous interpretation. In a matter of weeks, the Supreme Court struck the decree down, saying that detainment without due process could only happen in response to a suspicion that a person might be infected, not simply for violation of the lockdown order. Of course, Bukele pushed back, building a loophole, saying that those found in violation of the lockdown would not be held for violation of the order itself, but rather under suspicion that they might be infected because they violated lockdown orders. Put another way, the Supreme Court made a ruling, then Bukele and the police just decided to ignore it. This storyline continued in 2021. On February 28th, the country voted in a new legislative assembly, and 𝐌𝐸𝐴 𝐫𝐧𝐢𝐧𝐠, the new party founded by the president, decisively swept. This was no surprise. Through this all, Bukele was incredibly popular. Opinion polling hovered around 90% approval rating, making him one of, if not the most popular president in the world. His popularity translated to his party winning 56 of 84 seats. That's to say, they alone held a majority. No longer would Bukele have to face the opposition of the majority of the Legislative Assembly. No longer would he need to concede to FMLA and Arena wishes, so just one major roadblock remained: the Supreme Court itself. Thanks to the new 𝐌𝐸𝐴 𝐫𝐧𝐢𝐧𝐠 majority, though, all it took was a vote. The president said the body was making arbitrary rulings that were impeding his ability to manage the pandemic, the national legislature voted to dismiss the 5 dissenting judges, and Bukele filled the bench with 5 new ones that would vote as he wished. Bukele now, by proxy, held all 3 branches of power: executive, legislative, and judicial, and with that he could do, well, just about anything he wanted. El Salvador's weekend of March 25th through 27th, 2022 was tragic. Nobody's exactly sure why, but the gangs were mad. Many speculate in response to the breakdown of a secret truce between them and the government, special treatment in jail in exchange for relative peace on the streets. Whatever it was, some 87 seemingly random people were murdered, and Bukele was furious. Years of slow and steady progress, a small early sign of success of his territorial control plan, were reversed in just one weekend. So he went to the Legislative Assembly and they approved a 30-day so-called state of exception suspending constitutional rights. Police wouldn't have to tell people why they're being arrested, they wouldn't need to read them their rights, detainees wouldn't have a right to legal counsel, and they could be held for up to 15 days without seeing a judge. The state of exception paved the way for mass arbitrary detention. So that's exactly what came quick. Police and military swarmed gang strongholds, arresting any known members, but also arresting anyone who appeared that they could be in a gang. Tattoos, by themselves, were enough to get thrown in jail. Police were reportedly subject to daily arrest quotas and encountered little blowback for false arrests, pushing them to just arrest anyone that they could imagine being a gang member, regardless of facts or evidence. By midnight Sunday of that tragic weekend, some 600 people had been arrested. By the end of the week, 6,000. And now, 1 year on, with the state of exception having been renewed and renewed and renewed, nearly 70,000 suspected gang members have been detained. 2% of the nation's adult population is behind bars, in overcrowded prisons stuffed 3 or 4 times beyond capacity, waiting to make their way through an overburdened judicial system. Mothers and fathers still search in desperation for their arrested children, unable to track them down in the system even after a year, but increasingly they're being sent here, to the brand new Terrorism Confinement Center. This facility was built at breakneck pace once the gang roundups began, and opened for business in early 2023. It was introduced to the nation through a highly choreographed, scripted, and produced 35-minute video tour with Bukele. Throughout, the video stressed the president's influence on the project, how his logic and smarts created a better system, and exhibited the scale of the security forces, thanks to Bukele, the quality of their equipment, thanks to Bukele, and the ultimate degree of control the government would have, thanks to Bukele. After all, the prison was capable of holding some 40,000 inmates, making it the largest prison in the world, a single facility capable of housing the population of a small country. The thing is, all of this worked. While in March 2022, the country averaged 4.8 homicides a day, a bump upwards over the year's average of 3.1, April, the first full month of the roundups, saw just 1.3. In May, the trend continued, just 0.5 homicides a day. In fact, since April 2022, not a single month encountered an average daily homicide count over 1. While some question the exact validity of the data, the broad truth is undeniable. El Salvador is as safe as it's been in decades. For the first time in many residents' lifetimes, people can actually walk the streets, actually live life without fear. The feeling is freeing, life-changing. After decades of hopelessness, it's like living in a new nation, one with a better, brighter future. Bukele is as popular as he's ever been. The checks and balances of power may have been degraded, the judicial system may have broken down, thousands may be unjustly detained, but in the opinion of the vast majority of Salvadorans, the ends justify the means. Polling shows Bukele's approval rating still around 90%, making him still perhaps the most popular president in the world. Elsewhere, however, his image is different. Bukele has been condemned by just about anyone in the business of condemning. The United Nations, Human Rights Watch, the US State Department, international media. Very few come to his support globally. All express concern for the backsliding from democracy. El Salvador is 9 months away from its next presidential elections, and Bukele has announced he's running. This is despite what Article 152 of the country's constitution reads, quote, "The following shall not be candidates for the President of the Republic. He who has filled the presidency of the Republic for more than 6 months, consecutive or not, during the period immediately prior to or within the last 6 months prior to the beginning of the presidential period." This line was always interpreted to mean that one could not be president for 2 consecutive terms. Until 2021, when the newly overhauled Bukele-appointed Supreme Court reversed course, saying that consecutive terms would be allowed. Little legal justification was given, only that denying a second term to a popular president would be denying the will of the people. This is true. The people want Bukele to remain in power. He has seemingly solved the nation's biggest issue in a way that the people are supportive of. He's done the job he was democratically elected to do. Across every step in the process, he has retained the support of the people, even as he consolidated power across all 3 branches of government. He now has few, if any, legal checks on his power, considering he's able to modify or reinterpret the Constitution as he pleases. He is essentially a democratically elected dictator. The dissonance between the opinion of El Salvador and that of the rest of the world has an air of paternalism to it. It feels like the developed world is telling El Salvador that it knows best, that the Salvadoran people are incapable of making decisions for themselves. This dynamic has been a feature of the nation's relationship with the US in particular for decades. The superpower has long meddled with domestic Salvadoran politics. Much of the supposed international concern is likely rooted in this, a condescending feeling of impossibility that the country truly figured something out on its own. But a distinct other part of the concern is likely rooted in the more objective, rational, emotionless analysis people who didn't live through decades of warlike state are able to undertake. The potentially more accurate understanding of the sacrifices being made to solve the crippling crisis of gang violence. Leaders come and go. Even if Bukele is a perfect, benevolent dictator for life, he will eventually leave office, either democratically or through death. It is possible, even common, that checks and balances in a democratic system get in the way of progress. They make things slow, but they also make things methodical. It's through this process that decisions are properly vetted. It's a system of government designed to depend on the system itself rather than any particular individual. So it's a system of government that makes short-term sacrifices for the long-term gain. El Salvador, meanwhile, has flipped that on its head. It's putting all of its eggs in one basket and making long-term sacrifices for short-term gain. Maybe the people are right. Maybe it's a sacrifice worth making to solve the #1 issue holding the nation back. Or maybe the international observers are right. Maybe their outside perspective is valuable and the country truly is making a colossal mistake. But what's sure is that, if it is a mistake, it's their mistake to make. As a sovereign nation, the Salvadoran people have the right to decide on their own, without international meddling, what they want to do, even if that means the democratic election of a dictator. The accessibility of smartphones these days has changed a lot, but one interesting thing I think it's changed most dramatically is what happens when we don't have something to do. If we're waiting for the subway or to pick someone up or for a class to start, we tend to now fill those moments by checking Twitter or scrolling TikTok or some other way of getting a quick hit of dopamine because we tell ourselves that there's really nothing productive or meaningful we can do in 5 or 10 minutes. But all those 5 or 10 minutes really add up, so rather than wasting them, you can use them to learn something new. That's the idea behind our sponsor, Brilliant. They're a STEM learning platform that designs these incredible interactive courses that take big, complex subjects like calculus or physics or computer science and break them down into small bite-sized chunks that you can learn at your own pace. You might only learn a tiny bit of calculus in 5 minutes, but once you keep at it, filling all your free 5 minutes, it adds up into a meaningful understanding of a subject that might have previously seemed impossible to learn. I think it's incredible that they allow you to reach that satisfying feeling of achieving a challenging goal just by using the free time you already have. And truly anyone can learn through Brilliant no matter their educational background, as they have clear, concise explanations and then let you learn by doing through interactive challenges. So to try everything Brilliant has to offer free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/Wendover or click the button on screen. On top of that, the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription, and you'll be helping support Wendover while you're at it.